Hey guys, Cloud here, and today we will be covering how to add custom UI such as this one in-game. So the first thing you have to do when adding custom UI is decide what kind of input method you need for this. There are three main methods used. There is a barrel or chest, a chest minecart, and an ender chest, and each have their unique advantages and disadvantages. The barrel has the advantage of being easy to make look like a custom crafter. You can easily put a armor stand with a 3D model shifted down in order to disguise it as whatever your custom block is. And an advantage and disadvantage is that barrels can have hoppers to deposit items into them and take items out of them. If you want something automated, that can be pretty useful. And finally, the third kind of disadvantage is that other players can take from them. It could be seen as an advantage to some people, but essentially, if I'm accessing the barrel, other people can also access the barrel and take things that I'm trying to craft or take items in and out. The kind of trade-offs of the chest minecart, the advantage is you can easily hide it and make it follow the player, such as some kind of UI you would see on a server where you have a compass and you right-click the compass and it opens up a UI. Again, another kind of disadvantage to this is that other players can potentially open this while the player that is holding it has it opened. So that could be a bit annoying to people. So the third one is the ender chest. This one is the most multiplayer friendly in the sense that people can't open the ender chest and take your items because the ender chest is player specific container and player specific storage. One of the disadvantages is it's very hard to visually change it because when you open an ender chest, it extends the top of the animation into the block above it. So a singular block can't really hide it that well. The other issue is there's particles and the sound effect is pretty unique. But if you're willing to put up with that, this is the most multiplayer friendly option. So once you have picked what kind of input method you want to use, let's go over how to add the UI texture such as this into your game. So inside the resource pack that will be included in the link in the description, you can just download it if you want to browse the files as we're going through it. You can go to Assets, Minecraft, Models, Item, and inside here you can check out Barrier. So Barrier has a custom model data override, which basically says when the custom model data tag is a specific number, it will display a different model. So that's to say, when I give myself a barrier that has custom model data of 2, it will give me the UI that is located here, this model. And the model looks like this. So that specific model, if you go into the UI folder, is called menu. And menu has a parent of root. Root is essentially just a plane, a 2D plane that applies a texture to it that is the appropriate size. And it has some different display settings. And then this just changes the texture that's used on that plane. The texture is located in Minecraft Textures Custom UI. And you can basically add textures to this folder that look similar. You just copy and paste one of these base ones and rename it to your one that you like. So I'll just rename this to new. And I will open it inside a texture editing program, and you can edit the texture here. One thing to note is that you have to contain a empty space wherever you want things like items to show in your UI. And that is because the root model has a display property of translation where the translation space is at position 1. What this means is that the model goes rendered on top of the items. Now, if you want to render the model below the items for something such as a smithing table where it has a picture of a ingot that goes below the items inside the slot, that's possible just by going into the models and making a new model of root. Let's call this underlay, and this might already be inside the files, but I'm just showing you what it is. So instead of doing 1, we'll just draw to either 0 or -1. I think -1 is a proper value for that. And you'll have to adjust the other translations because maybe you have 2 items, so you want to put those 2 items that display the UI kind of in separate locations. But if you do something like this, and then let's go into menu and let's use underlay. Then any items will go on top of the UI, just like that. And this is good if you have something where you want to have some kind of a texture that goes underneath the item. So now that you know how to essentially make pages, we have to place this into the right spot. Now I'm just going to use a barrel, but this kind of applies to any kind of UI. So in the configuration of the 3D model, it is set up so that the translation makes it overlay correctly when the item's in the bottom right corner. But you may want to have multiple UIs, right? Like different UI stuff. So you'll have to make a model that overlays it properly when it's in the slot next to that, or maybe somewhere else, because you want to have a button in the bottom right corner. I don't really know what you're trying to do, but it's kind of assumed that the bottom right corner is a safe place to put things. So now we get into the command section, and for this I actually made 3 data packs that you can download in the description that each are slightly different but have a similar structure based on what type of crafter or what type of UI you're trying to implement in the game. But the kind of way that you design it is the same for everything. There's just some nuances with how to put items in and take items out of the UI that kind of change. So I will cover the main structure, but I'm not going to cover each code line by line and write it with you, because there's 28 functions, which is not too much, but it's too much for me to go line by line with you, because there's a couple hundred lines that all do very unique stuff. So some of the ways that I have set up kind of this framework is kind of trying to design it as flexible as possible. So let's go over what kind of things are created initially. So on reload, you have a UI scoreboard, which this is just general information about the UI, like fake players for doing different calculations. Then there's UI ID, and this refers to which UI you're using. Basically, it's a unique score that gets applied to each UI so that you can link it back to the player that's kind of manipulating the UI. Next, we have UI page, which has to do with which page you're on inside the UI. So in that case, this would be page 0, and this is page 1, and this is page 2. The next is UI index, and that's kind of a secondary page, and that's used in the vending machine example, where you basically have a gold ingot that goes as input, and I can change which potion I get for it because it's a vending machine. And that's what the index is used. So index basically is going to change which potion is being displayed. The final scoreboard here is open UI, and that's for detecting when you open the UI. But there will be a different one depending on what, there's different logic depending on which one you're using. So for the ender chest, you are going to have open UI 1, which is for opening an ender chest. And finally, we have a shulker box that is placed at a hard-coded location that's basically used to copy items out and in from storage using /loot. So now we look inside main, which is run every single tick of the game, so 20 times per second. So it essentially it looks for somebody that is opening a UI, and it tries to find a UI, okay? And these set of commands we'll cover later, but this basically is just logic ran at UIs, and this is just logic to kill items dropped out of a UI only when that UI is active for efficiency purposes. Essentially, if somebody is using a UI, then they could be taking items out of it, and then let's kill those items. But you can kind of, if you're having issues with, for some reason, people still getting those items spawned, you can move that around. So let's take a look at what UI find does. This is something, there is a lot of functions here you will not have to touch. I'm just going to tell you that right off the bat. I will direct you to what you're supposed to actually modify in order to add or edit the UI, but I'm just showing you how I implemented this just for the sake of knowing kind of like how the structure is. So inside find, we have a couple functions here. So at the start, that's where we begin. And we essentially just set a score to 12, and we copy the player's UI ID. So each player is going to get a UI ID at some point, but when somebody doesn't have a UI ID, you're just copying 0, meaning you're not opening a chest, and then it runs a raycast, okay? So the raycast is gonna have to do everything before we continue here. And the raycast essentially just moves forward in steps of 0.5, looking for a marker within 0.5 that is a UI. And when it finds that marker, then it will check if you have the same ID as the marker you're looking at. This kind of logic means that you are looking at an ID, you're looking at a marker that is one you already looked at. So the found command is actually going to, this is some like nuances to detect when they close the chest. So essentially, we don't reset their score that causes this line of commands to run until we detect that they left the chest. And we detect that they left the chest when this no longer is true. So we see, are you looking at the same one, or do you have no assigned ID, meaning that you are not looking in a chest? So the very first time this string of commands is run, this one will trigger, this one will not trigger. So then we run found. So found essentially copies the marker's ID onto a fake player, and it sets the loop score to -1, which means we found something. If the score reaches 0, then that means that this loop kind of completed without detecting a marker, because you remove 1 as long as it's still 1. So it will reach 0 if you don't detect something. But this sets it to -1, which basically tells the raycast to stop. And it gives this thing a tag, knowing that the UI is active, it's being used. So back inside start, if it's -1, that means we found a valid UI that we are either still looking at or is a new one that we just started looking at, and it copies the ID to the player. Now this is what happens if it doesn't detect a UI or you aren't looking at the one that you have linked. So basically we're just going to set the, we're going to exit the UI, which is just a function that's ran that closes out of the UI for the player and returns their items if necessary. Then we're going to set their ID to 0, and then we're going to set their open UI to 0 so we stop running this raycast command every tick. Okay, so all those things combined essentially let me detect when I'm opening a UI and when I'm closing a UI, and that's not used in the chest minecart system. I'll just brush over those really quickly at the end. I'll brush over the other two. We're just using the barrel for the simple case. But essentially it raycasts, so it's still raycasting at me right now, right? And then when I look away, it stops raycasting and I get my score set to 0. So here you see my score is 42 and now it's 0, just like that. And you can see that if I put the gold ingots inside here, I get them back. Okay, so that's how it associates a UI with a specific player. Now let's go ahead and see the other thing that happens in main, which is any UI that is considered active gets a different function ran as it. So this UI removes the active tag so that when the player exits the UI, it will no longer have the tag. And while the player is still in the UI, it basically spam adds the tag. So you're kind of like adding, remove, add, remove, add, remove every tick. Okay. Then this is setting the page change to 0. It's basically a flag detecting if you changed pages within the same tick. And this is important because if I click on a page here, it needs to change the page, and it needs to change the page without reading the changes on the page. And we'll go over that. You'll see that in a second here. So what it does is it copies the items onto a data storage, and it tries to copy those items onto the marker's MBT data. If it succeeds, that means that it was able to copy it, which means that the previous tick's data that was saved on the marker is not the same as the current ticks, which means something changed in the chest. And only when something changed do you run the refresh function. So otherwise, basically, only these commands are run for the marker. But if something is different, then go ahead and run a refresh. That means something changed in your UI. So when something changes in your UI, a lot of stuff happens. And this is where you are actually going to mess with things. So all this code, leave alone. The only code that you would mess with is this here. So if you want to add a new page, just copy a line here, paste a line here, change the number for page 4, and change the folder for whatever, my page, okay? Obviously in the default download, it will already have these set of pages, which you can remove or change or modify. And then you go into the page folder, because that's where these files are directing you to, and you just copy one of these and you rename it to my page. Okay, just like that. And things will happen inside there, and I'll show you what different things mean inside there. So that's kind of what you mess with personally as someone using this framework. Anyways, so the first thing that you do is you find who is controlling the UI. So it tries to find anybody that is looking at the UI, specifically just one player. It will only use one player later. Then you count basically how many things are inside the container. This is just helpful for when you first open the container. If the container was empty, then signify that the page is changing. This is just kind of a debugging thing, so it's useful for stuff like the ender chest, where you do need to clear you need to restore the previous ender chest when they leave it. It's not super useful for barrels, but when you first place a barrel UI, it won't have anything in it, so this kind of accounts for that. So next, we basically make sure that the page has at least some value, so we add 0, and then we figure out what page are we using, okay? So then, based on what page, we run a different start function, okay? So once we've loaded or done whatever the page is, this essentially just copies the data onto the marker, just to make sure that it doesn't, that it's updated on what is in the container, okay? So basically, if you don't have this line of code, it will run the refresh command at least 2 times each time you use it, because the next tick, your items have changed when you changed stuff from the logic here. Then it just removes the controlling user, and then it sets the kill score to 1, which basically is something that gets spam set to 1 and 0. Like when the armor stand is, this basically is spam set to 1 and 0, just to signify if any UI is being used, then go ahead and kill any items that are dropped out of the UI. So now let's take a look at pages, because pages are kind of important. So inside the menu, we have a function called start, and the structure for the pages is going to be really similar based on what you're trying to have accomplished in it. So first you want to clear any custom items the player has clicked on, okay? So this custom tag of null1b inside the UI namespace tag signifies that it is a item that you're trying to, that is like a button. It's something that they're not supposed to have. They're just something they're supposed to click. And this all items tag is basically every item in the game. So clear anything that has this MBT. Okay. So then it copies, this is where you basically isolate what you're trying to return to the player. And this is basically for any input that the player is putting into the chest that you don't want to be there. So for example, if I'm on the home page and I throw an ingot anywhere in the UI, it just comes back to me, okay? And the reason for that is I don't want people to put anything inside this UI. It's simply just a button UI, which means nothing should go inside of it. So we copy everything that was on the container, which is a data storage of what was in the input for the current frame. We copy that to the return storage, and then we delete anything that has null tag, because when we copy that, it will also include these buttons. So we delete those buttons as well. Then we go to the coordinates of that shulker box and we run the return function. The return function is very, very simple. It essentially just runs a loop for every item in that array and returns that item that's in the array. So then we have some logic that's based on the page change stuff. So we want to check what buttons were pressed, and we only want to check that when the page change is 0. And that's because if you change pages, the way that you check for button presses might detect a button press when the buttons were just loading in. So if we go into the function for button, you'll see how it checks for buttons. And it's kind of rudimentary, but it's very effective. So essentially, we have a button score, and the button score is set to 0. And then we check if there is not an item at slot 11. So if there isn't an item here, which means I clicked it, because if I click it, there will not be an item there, then set the button score to 1. If there isn't an item at slot 15, set the button score to 3. Okay, so that will basically mean you can only click one button and it will check which button you pressed, and it will only allow one input, because the score will, if both are true, then it will just do the bottom one. Okay, so then based on which button was pressed, we're changing the page value. So this changes the page score. If you change the page score, that means it's going to try and change the page. And then finally, if the page score is not the one that you're currently on, this is page 0. So if it's not 0, then turn on the page change flag and refresh the UI, which basically runs the entire set of functions again that were inside here a second time. And then finally, if the page is still the same, so it has not changed, if you're still on page 0, then run the mask function. And this is kind of the last thing you run inside of a new page is the mask function. And it's basically it's removing all of the items from the UI and putting all of the applicable items that go where they're supposed to by default. So here is slot 26 where you put the display, and here are the 3 buttons that you place, just like that. So it's kind of like your default buttons, and you'll include the null 1B. So that's how you do inputs like custom button pages like this, right? But now we have to go to vending machine, because this one actually shows the only other important thing, which is on-page changes and input-output behavior. So I put an input, I get an output. I put multiple inputs, I can shift and get multiple outputs. I put inputs and I change it, and I get that. And it also covers allowing people to put things in the UI. So inside Vend, that's where it's a little bit more messy. So if you have something that has inputs and outputs, you're going to want to copy the Vend folder so that you have kind of the framework for things that do inputs and outputs. So this is how you detect whether they are shift clicking or regular clicking. You can go through the commands yourself, but it essentially figures out how many output tagged items are in their inventory, how many output tagged items are in their inventory, and the thing that they have clicked. Because when you click on something, Clear can detect that, but when you click on something, it's not in the inventory. And then it basically compares those values to determine with either 1 or 2 whether they are clicking or shift clicking. Because if they're shift clicking, then these 2 values will be the same. If they are normal clicking, then this value will be some value higher than this value. Okay, so then it gets rid of all the buttons as usual. And this is where the return function gets a little bit special. So the items that we decide to return to the player are everything that isn't a button and isn't in slot 11, because you don't want to return things in slot 11. So that's why when I go ahead and put some dripstone here, it returns it to me. But when I put it here, it doesn't return it to me. All right. And finally, we run the return functions just to give things back. Now, this is where the logic kicks in, where it's a little bit more complicated. So we run the buttons. We first check the buttons, then we check the load, and then we check the buy. So the buttons is similar to before, except there's some nice new buttons. So one of the buttons is a back button, and that's what button ID 1 does. So if you run button 1, it just sets the page to 0, which takes you back to the main menu. But if you run 2 or 3, if you run 2, it will add 1 to the index. If you run 3, it will remove 1 from the index. And if the index is past the range it's supposed to be in, it kind of locks to the top or bottom. So if it's less than -1, then it puts it at 3. And if it's greater than 4, it puts it at 0 to make kind of a circular value. So the value just counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1, 0, 3, 2, 1, 0. And then the other thing we need to do here is we need to set the page change if you are not on page 3, because this is page 3. And we need to refresh if you're not on page 3. This is something most people forget I personally forgot to change this when I was implementing my own pages. So make sure that this value changes to the page that you're on. Okay, so now let's take a look at what loading does. So inside load, we essentially remove the previous load value. This is basically what items we want to load into the UI. That's what that means. So we check if there is a gold ingot in that slot, then we truly want to load. And this logic for like a crafter would be way more complicated. If you're trying to implement a crafter, good luck, it's way more complicated. You need to check like all the different combinations that could be there. And if you find the right combination that matches, then you decide to load. But anyway, so some kind of logic happens, and when the logic's done and it's true, then we decide, okay, we're good. We're officially loading this thing. So when we officially load the thing, we make sure the index has at least some value on it. So we add 0, and then we figure out which thing we're trying to load here. So if the index is 0, we copy this item. We basically place this item MBT onto the load. Okay. And it's the same MBT, just different potion types. Note here that null1b is still present because this is a button, but we also have an extra MBT of output, meaning this is a button that they click that will detect output. It's a special button that you're looking for being clicked. And this output flag is used in your detection of your shift versus left click. You don't detect shift versus left click for regular null because regular buttons don't need that behavior. Okay, so now after load, we run buy. So buy is checking if we're trying to buy something. So we check if the score is 1 and if there is still a gold ingot there, because you want to ensure that if they are going to buy this thing, they definitely meet the criteria. So you don't have any glitches or exploits. Then we will buy 1, because if the IO score is 1, that is a click. If it's 2, it's a shift. So if it's a shift, you buy all. So under buy 1, we do a couple spicy things here. So we remove 1, which is a item modifier. And when we remove 1, it removes 1 from the count. See, just remove 1. And we remove 1 from the item that is in the slot, so it will take away 1 gold ingot. And then we essentially copy the item that was loaded from this function. So we copy this item and we remove the slot. We set the slot to 0 and we remove the UI that indicates that it's a special item because we want to just give a player the genuine item. And then we loot give it to the player. So we just copy it to the shulker box and we give it to the player. Then so then we store how many gold ingots are left. And if there is only 1 gold ingot left, then we're just going to remove the load data. So this basically means that if in this frame there was only 1, right, and I click it, it will remove the load, so it will not display that item. It won't display it inside the mask. Okay, cool. So that's buy 1. And then we have buy all. Buy all is slightly different. You would think it's worse, but it's actually way easier. So we go into vending and we go to buy all. So we basically just remove whatever is at slot 11. We copy the count of whatever is at slot 11. So we copy how many gold ingots there are onto the item that we're trying to give back. We set the slot to 0, we remove the UI, and we give it back. And then we remove slot 11 because you took everything. And then we remove the load storage because we don't want to load that item anymore because it was purchased. Okay, so then the final step is to run the mask if you're on the same page. So the mask is going to be the same as before, input your custom items, right? But we also have some extra nuance here with the input slot. So we basically copy what is at slot 11 onto a data storage, okay? And then we check if whatever is in there is some kind of null, like if there was a button in there for some reason, then we just remove it. We're like, ignore that guy. But if it is still on that slot, then you are going to insert it. So you're kind of actually copying from tick to tick and propagating this item. So the item that you see in here is actually every tick is being copied and put back. Well, every time it refreshes, it's being copied and put back, even though you don't see it change. And then and then this line loads whatever was on load. And since load has a slot of 15, it'll just put the thing in slot 15. And then we have regular masking stuff. And that's it. So that's kind of the entirety of how this data pack works. Probably took way longer than I wanted, maybe 30 minutes or so. But that kind of goes through everything, and you can kind of play with it and try and make your own pages using this framework. Now, if you want to use something that is not the barrel or the chest, like such as the minecart, the logic is exactly the same. That's the cool part. The logic that you have to change inside these pages is pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is if you go into mask, it uses item replace entity instead of item replace block. Okay, so that's really the only difference, is it's item replace entity and it's data remove entity instead of data remove block. That's really the only difference. And all the other stuff is already handled there. There's some interesting kind of logical stuff that goes on. So the way that the chest minecart works is it uses a resource pack that I got from Misode. And the resource pack essentially does something very simple. It makes minecarts invisible. So minecarts are invisible, but it creates a custom 3D model of a minecart that gets put inside the tile offset of minecarts. So the one caveat, that like the one problem or not compatible thing about using the chest minecart system is it essentially will make it so you cannot use tile blocks for your minecart. So you can't put a TNT inside of a minecart unless you've already loaded it, if that makes sense. And I'm sure that you can figure out how to get back to using it. But it essentially, if it finds a minecart, then it puts it puts something in the minecart. So I'm sure you can find a way to use it again, like to mess with the models. But it could be annoying if you're doing that for some reason. But it's pretty rare that you actually do that. So if I do summon minecart, you'll notice that there is a minecart there, but you will also notice that there was a little tick, like a flash, depending on my frame rate capture rate, where it was not there. And that's because this is actually a 3D model of a minecart, not an actual minecart. So then when I summon a minecart that has a tag of invisible, it will not apply that 3D model, and thus the minecart will be invisible. And that's how you hide the chest minecart. So anyways, the actual code is a little bit different, because you're spawning this thing and teleporting it to the player that owns it. So I just look for the MBT that has this custom tag, and I go ahead and spawn this thing. So this just gives me a compass with an MBT of UI1B, and when I have it, it will spawn the thing. And actually, I forget this, but it has to be add@s. And we'll just reload that so it's a little bit better. There we go. So it spawns it at me. And then when I right click, it will just it'll just open the UI, because there's a minecart in my head. You can see the shadow. And then essentially it's very similar logic, except I have this extra line down here that is applied to minecarts that are not invisible. And then I have this extra logic, which basically closes the UI, so it kills the minecart when you're not holding it. Okay, so all of the code is the same. You're just using a different path when you're setting items. You're not using item modify block, you're using item modify entity. But a lot of the logic is the same. Then for ender chests have their own kind of special handling system. So if I have stuff in my ender chest, well, that's a problem if I want to use the UI. So basically it copies those items to a button on my head with a specific cursive binding enchantment level. And then when I look away, it takes that off my head and puts it back inside my ender chest. And I already set up all the code, so you don't have to worry. If I put a custom helmet on my head and use the UI, it won't put a button. And everything is completely restored. All of the tags are removed that are special. So it kind of handles all that for you. And again, instead of using masks, instead of sending the masks to the block items, you're sending it to the player ender items. And the some other things are a little bit special, like for example, to completely clear everything, you can't use data remove because it's the player. So you have to set every single slot to air, if that makes sense. So inside your page structure, let me show you the differences here. So if we go inside the vending page structure and I go to mask, you'll see the mask is a little bit more complicated because you have to replace at p tag equals this. So you have to replace the player, and you have to go to the player and you have to replace their ender chest slots, and you have to run the function clear instead of data remove. And that's really the only differences. Anyways, guys, so that is kind of the whole framework. I know that maybe if you've gotten to this point of the video, you're really interested in using this framework, or maybe you just like watching my videos. I don't know if those people exist, but I have been working on a website potentially that I may put together that kind of does all this for you for basic UI cases, in terms of click a button and it will run whatever function you inputted, similar to like an advancement, how an advancement runs a reward function. I just wanted to put out this video before I even go into making this website, because even if I do have the website, it'd be nice just to have an explanation of how to do this sort of thing. Because if I make a video on the website, it's not really going to cover all the in-depth code of how the thing works. But I do have the start of a website working. So you see I have this menu, right? And when I hover my mouse over the slots, it highlights just like in game. And when I right click, it will pull up a little mini menu that doesn't do anything important yet, but it overlays it onto this slot. So I want to make it so that when I right click, it will do like a little animation. So it'll like do a little animation for a menu, and it would have like buttons and input that you can do for each of the different spots. And then it would just generate a data pack for you. And this would basically work for anything like if you're making like a server, or some kind of like, if you're trying to say recreate Sky Wars, you could, or Hypixel Bed Wars, you could recreate their Bed Wars shop UIs actually pretty, like I want to make it so you could recreate them using this website generator. Anyways, guys, if you're interested in seeing more, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you next time. Peace.